The fog rolled in from the Irish Sea the day Corporal James Edward Turner first set foot on English soil, thick and grey as gunpowder smoke, swallowing the docks of Liverpool Hole. February 1943. The war was everywhere and nowhere at once, invisible in the mist but present in every sandbag, every taped window, every face that turned toward the gangplank as the transport ship disgorged its human cargo. James descended with his duffel bag slung across one shoulder, boots striking wet cobblestones that gleamed like obsidian under the dim harbour lights. Behind him came the others, 200 black soldiers of the 320th Quartermaster Battalion, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air, their eyes adjusting to this strange new country that smelled of coal smoke and salt water, and something else entirely, something James couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. He'd expected fear from the British faces watching from the warehouse doorways and the edge of the dock. Fear or contempt, or that particular coldness he'd known all his life in Mississippi, the way white folks looked through you like you were made of glass. But the faces he saw now held only curiosity, fatigue, and something that might have been relief. A woman in a wool coat and headscarf raised her hand in a small wave. An old man in a Home Guard uniform nodded. A group of dock workers paused in their labor to watch the soldiers pass, and one of them called out in an accent James could barely decipher, something that sounded like a greeting. James kept his head down anyway. 23 years of survival had taught him the wisdom of invisibility, the necessity of making himself smaller, quieter, less. The U.S. Army had taught him more of the same, though they dressed it up in regulations and protocol. Segregated units, separate mess halls, white officers who spoke to him like he was a child or a piece of furniture. The crossing from New York had been miserable, cramped below decks while white soldiers occupied better quarters above. He'd spent the voyage reading and rereading his mother's last letter until the creases threatened to split the paper entirely. Her words about his younger sister's graduation from the colored high school, her prayers for his safety, her reminder that he represented not just himself, but everyone who looked like him. The battalion marched through Liverpool's darkened streets toward temporary barracks, their boots echoing off brick facades pockmarked with shrapnel scars. The city had been bombed repeatedly during the Blitz, and entire blocks stood gutted, skeletal, open to the sky. Yet between the ruins, life persisted with stubborn British determination. A corner pub glowed dimly behind blackout curtains. A woman cycled past with a basket of rationed groceries. Children played some incomprehensible game in a bomb crater, their laughter sharp and bright in the gloom. At the barracks, a white lieutenant from the advance unit delivered the standard briefing with mechanical efficiency. Supply lines, duty rosters, chain of command. Then came the part James had been waiting for, the part that made his jaw tighten and his hands curl into fists against his thighs: fraternization policies. The word hung in the cold air of the assembly hall like a curse. Black soldiers were to maintain discipline, represent the United States Army with dignity, avoid situations that might cause incidents with white troops or local populations. The lieutenant's voice held no particular malice, just bureaucratic indifference, which somehow made it worse. But that night, lying on a thin mattress in the barracks and listening to the others breathe and shift and whisper in the darkness, James heard something different in their voices. Private Willie Hayes from Alabama spoke of the woman at the dock who'd waved. Sergeant Marcus Webb from Detroit mentioned the pub they'd passed, how the door had stood open and warm light had spilled out onto the cobblestones, and nobody had shouted at them to move along. Corporal Thomas Reed from Georgia, usually silent, said quietly that a little girl had smiled at him. Actually smiled. Not that frozen expression white children back home wore when their mothers yanked them away from black men on sidewalks. Hope was dangerous. James knew this. Hope could get you killed or worse. But he felt it anyway, small and insistent, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. The work began immediately. The 320th was assigned to logistics and supply operations, the unglamorous machinery that kept the war effort functioning. They unloaded ships, sorted materiel, drove trucks through the English countryside, delivering everything from ammunition to medical supplies to the endless tons of food required to feed an army preparing for invasion. The labor was backbreaking and constant, but it was also profoundly different from anything James had experienced in uniform. British dock workers treated them like fellow laborers, sharing tea from battered thermoses during breaks, teaching them incomprehensible Scouse slang, complaining about rationing and the weather, and Churchill with the easy camaraderie of shared misery. The British officers who coordinated with the American quartermaster units spoke to James and the others directly. Without that telltale hesitation, that fractional pause before addressing a black soldier that James had learned to recognize as precisely as a musician recognizes a wrong note. In the third week, James's unit was transferred to a base near Birmingham, closer to the industrial heart of England, where factories churned out tanks and aircraft and the implements of modern war. The Midlands landscape was gentler than he'd expected. Green even in late winter, rolling fields divided by ancient hedgerows, villages of stone cottages clustered around medieval churches. The contrast with the devastation of Liverpool was startling, though here too the war had left its marks. The base itself was a sprawling complex of Quonset huts and muddy roads, but beyond its perimeter lay a town called Sutton Coldfield, and it was there that everything changed. The first time James entered the Red Lion pub on a Saturday evening in March, he did so with his heart hammering against his ribs and every muscle tensed for violence. Willie Hayes had convinced him, insisting that the locals had been friendly, that they'd seen other black soldiers drinking there without incident. James's instincts screamed caution, but something else, that dangerous hope, drew him forward. The pub was warm and dim and thick with cigarette smoke and the yeasty smell of beer. Conversation washed over him, accents he was learning to pass, the clipped vowels and swallowed consonants of Birmingham speech. James froze just inside the door, waiting for the silence to fall, for heads to turn, for the landlord to point at the exit. Instead, a man at the bar glanced over, nodded, and returned to his pint. A woman laughed at something her companion said. The publican, a heavy-set man with magnificent mutton chops, caught James's eye and raised his eyebrows in inquiry. "What'll it be, mate?" His voice was neither friendly nor hostile, just matter-of-fact, the voice of a man taking an order. James ordered a pint, his voice steady despite everything. The beer appeared, warm and dark and entirely unlike American lager. He paid, carried it to an empty corner table, and sat with his back to the wall, watching. Willie appeared beside him 10 minutes later, grinning like he'd won a prize. Then Marcus, then Thomas. They drank their warm beer, and nobody told them to leave. Nobody even seemed to particularly notice them. And when James finally allowed himself to relax just slightly, he realized his hands were shaking. This was what it felt like to be unremarkable, to be ordinary, to walk into a public space and be met with indifference rather than hatred or fear. The sensation was so foreign, it was almost painful. The British people of Sutton Coldfield, like those in countless towns and villages across England, had their own wartime concerns. Rationing meant meat once a week if you were lucky. Butter, a distant memory, replaced by margarine, clothing coupons that had to be hoarded for months to afford a new pair of shoes. The blackout regulations meant stumbling through darkness every night, curtains drawn tight, streetlights extinguished, the whole country hiding from Luftwaffe bombers. They were tired and worn and making do, patching clothes until they fell apart, queuing for hours for basic goods, living with the constant low-level anxiety of loved ones in combat, of invasion threats, of the war stretching endlessly toward some uncertain conclusion, but they were also, James discovered, curious, welcoming in a way that seemed almost reckless by American standards. British civilians invited soldiers into their homes for Sunday dinner, sharing meager rations with genuine hospitality. They asked questions about America with frank interest, about Mississippi and Alabama and Detroit, about jazz music and Hollywood films, and what it was like in that vast, wealthy country across the Atlantic. And when James answered, they listened, actually listened, without that glaze of polite disinterest that white Americans wore when forced to acknowledge black voices. It was a 16-year-old factory worker named Dorothy Chambers who first made James laugh, really laugh, the kind of laughter that comes from surprise and delight rather than nervous energy. She was leaving the munitions plant one evening as James's truck convoy rolled past, her face smudged with powder residue, her auburn hair tucked under a scarf, and she'd waved at them with such unself-conscious enthusiasm that Willie had honked the horn, and she'd laughed, and somehow that moment had crystallized something. The next Saturday, she was at the Red Lion with two other girls from the factory, and they'd joined James's table without invitation or hesitation, and Dorothy had said something wickedly funny about their foreman that James hadn't quite caught, but that made everyone roar. She was not conventionally pretty by magazine standards, too sturdy, too freckled, her teeth slightly crooked. But her eyes were shrewd and kind, and when she smiled, it transformed her entire face, and she had a laugh that seemed to surprise even herself, bubbling up sudden and genuine. She worked 12-hour shifts making shell casings, lived with her mother and younger brother in a narrow terraced house near the railway, and she talked to James like he was a person rather than a category. That was the revolutionary part. That was what kept drawing him back to the pub on Saturday evenings, kept him volunteering for supply runs that passed through Sutton Coldfield, kept him writing letters home to his mother that carefully omitted certain details. Dorothy treated him like a man. Full stop. She teased him about his accent, about American ignorance of geography, about his initial confusion with British money. She asked his opinion about the war, about music, about whether he thought Churchill was as impressive in person as he sounded on the wireless. She touched his arm when she laughed, unconscious and easy, and the first time she did it, James had felt like he'd been struck by lightning. The others noticed, of course. Marcus found himself spending time with Dorothy's friend Ruth, a nurse at the local hospital who was small and fierce and had lost her husband at Dunkirk. Willie began walking out with a Land Army girl named Margaret, who could fix any mechanical device and swore like a sailor. Thomas, shy Thomas, somehow attracted the attention of a young widow named Alice who worked in the library and wrote poetry she was too embarrassed to share. The connections formed naturally, organically, in the unique hothouse atmosphere of wartime where normal rules seemed suspended and everyone understood that time might be desperately short. But for James and Dorothy, something deeper was developing, something that terrified him even as it drew him forward like gravity. They began meeting away from the pub crowds, walking together along the canal towpath on Sunday afternoons, when James could get leave, sitting in the cathedral, close where the ancient stones held centuries of silence. She told him about her father who died in the last war, about her brother who wanted to join up but was too young, about the night the sirens had wailed and her family had huddled in the Anderson shelter in their garden while bombs fell on Birmingham and the sky turned orange. He told her about Mississippi, about picking cotton as a child, about his mother's determination that he and his sister would get educated, about the library in the colored section of town where he'd discovered Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois, and realized there was a whole world beyond the suffocating boundaries of Jim Crow. The first time he kissed her, they were standing behind the cathedral in the gathering dusk, and she had been crying about something. He couldn't remember what. And he'd reached out to brush tears from her cheek, and she'd turned her face into his palm, and then it had simply happened, natural as breathing. Her lips were soft, and she tasted of tea, and her hands came up to frame his face, and for a moment the entire war ceased to exist, the whole complicated, dangerous world narrowing to just this, just them. Afterwards she'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, and said simply, "I don't care what anyone thinks." And he'd believed her, even though he knew it was more complicated than that, even though he knew the world would very much care indeed. The U.S. Army had not anticipated the warm reception black soldiers received in Britain. The military police, those white MPs with their helmets and nightsticks and casual authority, began appearing in the towns around the bases with increasing frequency. They weren't there to maintain order so much as to enforce a particular kind of order, the kind that existed back home, the kind written into law and custom and enforced with violence when necessary. James saw them watching the pubs, noting which soldiers entered, which local women smiled at black men in uniform. The official line was military discipline. The unofficial reality was segregation exported to British soil. White officers began implementing policies that restricted black soldiers to certain establishments on certain nights, creating a rotation system that kept them separated from white troops. When pressed, they claimed it was to prevent incidents, to maintain morale, to respect the sensibilities of the British population. But the British population, by and large, did not request these measures. Pub owners protested being told which customers they could serve. Local councils objected to American racial policies being imposed on English towns. The contradiction was stark and increasingly untenable. James witnessed his first serious incident outside a dance hall in Birmingham in May. A group of white soldiers from a different unit had objected to seeing black soldiers dancing with white British girls. Words were exchanged. Someone threw a punch. Within minutes it had escalated into a full brawl, MPs rushing in with clubs, British civilians shouting and some of them fighting too, taking the side of the black soldiers against the white Americans, which only enraged the white troops further. James had stood to one side with Dorothy pressed against the wall behind him, watching men who supposedly fought for the same country trying to kill each other over who had the right to dance. The MPs arrested 6 black soldiers, and none of the white ones. James learned later that one of the black soldiers, a private from South Carolina, was court-martialed and sentenced to hard labor. The white soldiers received reprimands. The dance hall was subsequently designated whites only for American personnel. Dorothy was furious in a way James had never seen, her face white with rage, her voice shaking. She wrote letters to her MP, to the local newspaper, to anyone who might listen. She wasn't alone. British civilians were increasingly vocal in their opposition to American segregation practices, seeing them as fundamentally un-British, an affront to the very values the Allies claimed to be defending. American racism, transplanted to English soil, became a source of genuine diplomatic tension, but official policy was one thing. Reality on the ground was another. James and Dorothy became more careful, meeting in places where they were less likely to be seen by MPs, timing their walks for when patrols were unlikely. The paranoia was exhausting and degrading, reduced to sneaking around like criminals, but the alternative was unthinkable. James had heard stories now, stories of black soldiers confined to base for fraternization violations, stories of transfers to different units as punishment, whispers of worse things, beatings administered away from witnesses. The summer of 1943 brought longer days and the intensifying sense that something massive was building, that the war was approaching some kind of climax. Training exercises increased in frequency and intensity. Entire divisions practiced amphibious landings on English beaches. The supply requirements became staggering, warehouses filling with material that would eventually cross the Channel. James and his unit worked 18-hour days, and in the brief intervals between exhaustion and sleep, he stole moments with Dorothy. She told him she loved him on an August evening, sitting by the canal watching swans glide across water that reflected the sunset like melted copper. She said it simply, without drama, a statement of fact. James felt something crack open inside his chest, felt terror and joy in equal measure. He loved her too, had loved her probably since that first evening at the Red Lion, but saying it aloud made it real, made it dangerous, made it something that could be lost. "I don't know what happens," he said, his voice rough. "After, when this is over." "Nobody knows what happens after," Dorothy replied. "We could all be dead tomorrow. The whole city could be rubble. That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." She took his hand, laced her fingers through his. "I don't care about after. I care about now." But James cared about after because he understood, in ways Dorothy's kindness prevented her from fully grasping, that after would demand accounting, after would require explanations, after would separate them as surely as an ocean. That autumn, Private Willie Hayes got a girl pregnant. Her name was Margaret, the Land Army girl who could fix anything, and she was terrified and defiant in equal measures. Willie wanted to marry her, was desperate to marry her, but the Army regulations made it nearly impossible. Black soldiers required special permission from their commanding officers to marry British women, permission that was routinely denied. The bureaucratic obstacles were deliberately insurmountable. Character investigations, waiting periods, documentation requirements that could take months or years to satisfy. Willie filled out the forms anyway, submitted the applications, showed up at his CO's office weekly to inquire about status. The answer was always the same. Still processing. Check back next week. Margaret's pregnancy began to show. Her family, working class and practical, accepted the situation with surprising equanimity. Her father, a railway worker, sat Willie down for a conversation about responsibility and said he'd be proud to have him as a son-in-law, war or no war, army permission or no permission. But Willie's commanding officer remained unmoved. The regulations were the regulations, perhaps after the war, when things settled down. "For now, denied." James watched his friend fracture under the stress, watched him try to figure out how to provide for a woman and child from overseas, watched him realize that the army could ship him out tomorrow and there would be nothing he could do, no legal tie, no claim, nothing but Margaret's word that he was the father and his desperate promises to return. Other stories circulated through the black units. Men who'd married British women in unofficial ceremonies, hand-fasting or common law arrangements that held no legal weight. Men who'd left behind pregnant girlfriends, some knowingly, some not. Men who'd tried to desert when their units received deployment orders, choosing prison over abandoning their British families. The authorities responded with increased restrictions, tighter controls, harsher punishments for fraternization. The message was clear. Black soldiers were temporary fixtures, laborers and cannon fodder, not potential husbands or fathers or permanent residents. James began having nightmares. In them, he was running through fog-shrouded streets, chasing something or fleeing something, he could never tell which. And Dorothy's voice called to him from somewhere he couldn't reach, and he'd wake up gasping in the barracks' darkness with his heart trying to punch through his ribs. The winter of 1943 crawled toward 1944, and the invasion preparations reached fever pitch. Security tightened, leaves were cancelled, the base went into lockdown. James managed to get word to Dorothy through a British civilian who worked on base. A single folded note that said he couldn't get into town, that he'd write when he could, that he thought about her constantly. He didn't know if the message reached her. He didn't know anything except that the machinery of war was grinding forward, and he was a single gear in a mechanism too vast to comprehend. D-Day came and went. The 320th wasn't part of the initial invasion, but they felt its reverberations, the massive movement of men and materiel toward the coast, the sudden emptiness of bases as combat units shipped out, the casualty reports that started filtering back. James's unit remained in England, maintaining supply lines that stretched across the Channel to Normandy. The work was endless and critical and boring in the way that logistics is always boring, moving tons of supplies to feed the beast of modern warfare. He saw Dorothy again in July, a stolen afternoon, when he drove a supply truck through Birmingham and detoured through Sutton Coldfield. She looked thinner, older, her face drawn with something that might have been exhaustion or might have been something worse. They walked to their spot behind the cathedral, and she told him she was pregnant. James felt the world tilt sideways. His first thought was joy, pure and uncomplicated, a bright spike of emotion that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before reality crashed down. His second thought was terror. His third was a desperate, futile calculation. How long before his unit shipped out? Whether there was any way to get married before that happened? What he could possibly do to protect her and the child from 8,000 miles away. Dorothy was calmer than he was, or perhaps she'd already passed through the panic stage into something like acceptance. She told him she'd keep the baby, that her mother would help, that they'd manage somehow. She told him she didn't expect anything from him, which was the most painful thing she could have said, because it meant she'd already accepted his absence, already planned for a future that didn't include him. "And I'll come back," he said, knowing how empty it sounded, knowing that thousands of men had said the same thing to thousands of women, and most of them were lying or deluded or both. After the war. "I'll come back. Maybe," Dorothy said, and smiled, and the smile was gentle and terrible, because it meant she didn't believe him, or didn't believe it mattered, or had already begun the process of letting go. They spent the afternoon together. Their last afternoon, as it turned out, though neither of them knew it at the time. They sat in the cathedral close and watched clouds move across the sky and talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation two people might have if their lives were normal and the world wasn't burning. When James had to leave, Dorothy kissed him once, fierce and brief, and then walked away without looking back. He watched her go, her figure growing smaller, the distance between them measured in yards, and then in something much larger, something unbridgeable. The 320th received orders in September. They were shipping to France, taking over supply operations for the advance through Belgium and toward Germany. James had 48 hours to settle his affairs. He wrote to Dorothy, a long letter that took him hours to compose, saying everything he couldn't say in person, making promises he had no way to keep. He included every dollar he'd saved, money orders and cash wrapped carefully in paper, enough to help with the baby, not enough for anything like security. He addressed it to her mother's house and mailed it, and hoped it would reach her, and knew that money wasn't what she needed, that what she needed was him, and that was the one thing he couldn't provide. He never got a response. Whether the letter reached her, whether she chose not to write back, whether circumstances prevented it, he never knew. The unit moved to Southampton, then across the Channel, then into the grinding advance across France. The war consumed everything, demanded every ounce of attention and energy, left no space for anything except survival and duty and the endless, mind-numbing work of keeping an army supplied. James survived the war. Not heroically, not memorably, just survived, did his job, followed orders, stayed alive through a combination of luck and caution. He was in Germany when the war in Europe ended, in a town whose name he never learned, surrounded by refugees and displaced persons and the smoking ruins of the Reich. The celebrations felt hollow. He drank the victory toasts and shook hands with strangers and felt nothing except a vast exhaustion and the gnawing awareness of everything he'd left behind. The demobilization process was chaos. Units were shuffled, reorganized, some sent to the Pacific Theater, others designated for occupation duty, others scheduled for return home. James's battalion spent 6 months in Germany before receiving orders to ship back to the States. 6 months of occupying a defeated country, of watching the victors divide the spoils, of feeling increasingly detached from everything that was happening around him. He wrote to Dorothy's address 3 times from Germany. None of the letters were answered. He tried to tell himself there were 1,000 reasons why, mail being unreliable, the war having disrupted everything, her having moved somewhere else. He tried not to imagine the alternative, that she'd decided a clean break was easier, that raising a mixed-race child in post-war England was complicated enough without maintaining ties to an absent American soldier. In February 1946, James boarded a transport ship in Bremerhaven bound for New York. The crossing was calmer than the one that had brought him to England 3 years earlier, but he barely noticed. He stood at the rail watching the coast of Europe disappear into the grey Atlantic and thought about Dorothy, about the child he'd never seen, about the life he might have had if the world were different, if history were different, if he were someone else entirely. Coming back to Mississippi was like stepping into a nightmare he'd temporarily escaped. Nothing had changed. Jim Crow was still law. Segregation was still enforced with legal violence and extra-legal terror. And the brief dream of being treated like a human being dissolved like morning fog. The local whites made it clear that his service meant nothing, that he was still just another no, who needed to remember his place. James bit his tongue and kept his head down and got a job at a lumber mill and tried to forget England, tried to convince himself it had never happened, that it had been some kind of fever dream. But he couldn't forget Dorothy. At night, lying in his childhood bedroom in his mother's house, he'd remember her laugh, her crooked teeth, the way her hand felt in his. He'd think about the child, would be 4 years old now, 5, 6, growing up without a father, growing up in a country that wasn't quite ready to know what to do with children who looked different. He'd imagine writing to her again, imagine showing up in Sutton Coldfield unannounced, imagine some Hollywood ending where everything worked out. But he never did. The paralysis was absolute. The distance was too great, the complications too immense, the likelihood of rejection too painful. He married a local girl eventually, a teacher named Evelyn, who was patient and kind and never asked about the war. They had children, 2 sons who never knew about their half-sibling across the ocean. James built a life, not the life he'd wanted, but a life nonetheless, quiet and constrained and safe. He never spoke about England except in the most general terms, funny stories about warm beer and incomprehensible accents. Nothing about Dorothy, nothing about the child, nothing about what it had felt like to be human for a brief, shining moment. But across the Atlantic, in towns and cities throughout Britain, over 2,000 children like James's were growing up. Brown babies, they were called, sometimes affectionately, sometimes not. Children of black American servicemen and white British mothers. Some were raised in loving homes where their mothers fought fiercely to protect them from prejudice. Some were given up for adoption, placed in children's homes, scattered across the country, or even sent abroad. Some never knew who their fathers were. Almost all grew up in a Britain that wasn't quite sure what to make of them, that had no framework for understanding mixed-race identity in a context that wasn't colonial. These children changed Britain in ways subtle and profound. They integrated communities, whether those communities were ready or not. They forced conversations about race and belonging and national identity. They represented the human cost of wartime romance, the consequences of American racism, the complexity of love in impossible circumstances. Many spent their lives searching for the fathers who'd vanished back to America, hoping for connection, for acknowledgement, for some explanation of why they'd been left behind. James died in 1987, taking his secrets with him. His wife found a photograph when sorting through his things, a creased black and white image of a young woman with auburn hair and a crooked smile, standing in front of a building that was clearly British. On the back, in James's handwriting, Dorothy, 1943. Evelyn studied it for a long time, this ghost from her husband's past, and then she placed it in an envelope with his other military papers and put it all away. In England, Dorothy Chambers lived to be 83. She never married, raised her daughter Anne alone with her mother's help, worked her entire life at the munitions factory that later became an electronics plant. She told Anne about her father, showed her the photograph she'd kept, explained as best she could why he'd never come back, and grew up feeling incomplete, caught between identities, neither fully British nor American, her mixed heritage visible in her features but invisible in her paperwork, her official existence. She had children of her own, gave them the story as her mother had given it to her, tried to instill pride rather than shame. The generation after the war tried to forget these complications, these messy human stories that didn't fit neat narratives of victory and homecoming. But the children remembered. The brown babies and their children and their children's children remembered. They formed organizations, searched for answers, used genealogy and DNA testing and the opening of military records to piece together the stories of fathers who'd crossed an ocean and left pieces of themselves behind. Some found what they were looking for. Some discovered that their fathers had died long ago, or had built new families and wanted no reminders of wartime indiscretions, or simply couldn't be found in the vast spaces of America. But the searching itself mattered, the insistence that these stories had value, that these lives had meaning, that love in wartime wasn't a frivolous thing to be forgotten, but a profound human truth that had reshaped two nations whether they acknowledged it or not. The fog still rolls in from the Irish Sea. The cathedral in Sutton Coldfield still stands, its stones holding the memory of a young soldier and a factory worker who sat in its shadow and dreamed of impossible futures. The pub where they first met is now something else, renovated and modernized, the ghosts of 1943 invisible to the Friday night crowds. But the history persists, written in genealogies and aging photographs, and the faces of grandchildren who carry African and European heritage in equal measure, who embody the contradiction and the promise of that strange wartime moment when black American soldiers discovered what it meant to be welcomed, and British civilians discovered that the racial hierarchies of the American South had no natural authority on English soil. James and Dorothy were just two people among thousands. Their story neither unique nor particularly remarkable, except that it was theirs, except that they lived it, except that they produced a life that continued after they were gone, spreading forward through time like ripples across water. The brown babies and their descendants stand as living monuments to a brief moment when American racism collided with Britain's wartime openness and produced something unexpected and complicated. Their existence echoes across both sides of the Atlantic, proof that war not only destroys but reshapes lives, writing history in flesh, memory and unlikely love.